strange things for me about growing older has been that I assume I know certain things. They're ingrained in my memory, and I just take them to be true. One of those things, and I think this applies to many, many people, is the story of Anne Frank. We feel we know the bare bones, anyway, of what that story is. Dutch girl, teenager, trapped in an attic during the Nazi occupation of Holland, keeps a diary, and then after the war, I'm not sure what happens, but the book is published and she becomes famous. That's what I thought I knew about Anne Frank. And I even went to see her house. Couldn't get in because of the number of tourists who were around, but I went to see her house in Amsterdam this year. But in fact, that really isn't her story. And when I found out what the story really was, I was quite shocked. She was German, a German Jew. Her family moved to the Netherlands when Hitler rose to power. And when the Nazis took over the Netherlands, the family hid in an annex, a few rooms, behind a bookcase in a house in Amsterdam for about 2 years, till about 1944. And during that time, Anneliese Frank kept a diary of her thoughts. It turns out that she was a very good writer and wanted to be a journalist when she grew up. She wrote in her diary, "I want to go on living after my death." Well, she has. Her journal is one of the most famous books in the world. It's been made into TV shows and movies and so on. And I assumed in my ignorance that she'd outlived the occupation experience and gone on to become an adult. That's not true. Because in 1944, somebody snitched on the family. And the Gestapo burst into the house in Amsterdam, opened the bookcase, and arrested them. And Frank and her sister were taken away to Auschwitz concentration camp and then moved to Bergen-Belsen. She wasn't executed. She caught typhus. At the time, there was an epidemic of typhus, and something like 17,000 prisoners died of it. It takes about 12 days, I think, to die of typhus, and it's a horrible, horrible end. Her sister died first, and then the next day, Anne Frank died. Now, the thing is that the concentration camp was liberated, the prisoners were liberated only a few months later. But by that time, Anne Frank was already gone, and she was 15 when she died in 1945. So I, having tried before to go into her transition pictures, gave it a second go. And this is what happened. Initially, it's a little grueling to get your head around, but it works out in ways that I never could have foreseen. When I went into the energy of Anne Frank, she was descending a spiral staircase, but one that had been rough-hewn into the earth. It was held up around the edges by logs, by posts. It was like a pit. And she had no choice but to go down into it as her animating force faded. This was her death from typhus. And it really must have been a horrible experience. Not only was she in a concentration camp, but the symptoms must have been terrifying. Because once she got down the steps, the pit was filled with a dark, viscous substance. There was no going back. She had to step into whatever this substance was. I personally found this terrifying. Because as she lowered herself into the substance, tendrils underneath the surface wrapped themselves around her legs and started to pull her down. She must have felt like she was suffocating. Even though she fought it, There was nothing she could do to resist the pull. And eventually, horrifyingly, in the pictures, she was subsumed beneath the surface and drowned in her illness, essentially. And the next thing I saw, she was being forced through an opening in the ceiling of this allegorical cave that I always see, this symbolic cave. It doesn't exist. It's just a way for me to understand what these people are feeling as their consciousness moves towards ascension. She dropped down into the cave and she was not just disoriented, but distressed. This girl had come from a concentration camp and a terrible disease, and she had no clue where she was. She had no clue what was happening. She may have been delirious when she died. In the middle of the cave was a pool. Only it wasn't a pool of water, as it so often is in these pictures. It had a silvery, reflective surface. And she knelt down, leaned over, and peered at her reflection in the pool. But as I looked into the pool with her, something happened that I have not seen before. And I would say that it actually changed my perspective on life. That doesn't often happen. We so often hear talk of the higher self, the soul, the spirit, all these things that we can't see, but we take on trust. We believe even though there is no physical proof that we can observe through our senses or whatever. We just say, oh yeah, there's higher self. We have guides. Oh yeah, God's watching over us. Whatever those phrases are. When I looked into the pool alongside her, there was a streak of light, like an arc of light, reflected in the surface. I couldn't see it in the cave itself, but when I looked over into the reflection of the cave, there it was. An arc of bright light behind Anne Frank's consciousness. It was her higher self, her guides, her guardian angels, whatever you want to call this. But it didn't feel unique to her. It felt like I had glimpsed something that we all have. Our higher self, our guides, looking over us, guarding us, guiding us. We're not alone. Anne Frank was not alone in this experience. We are not alone in our mortal experience. I don't know why I needed convincing of that. But I came away from these pictures with this epiphany in my head that these aren't just words we're saying. These aren't just concepts we're playing with. This is real. There are forces, higher dimensional, higher frequency forces around us, benevolent, benign, loving, that are steering us through life if only we will pay intuitive attention to them. She had her forces right there with her. And she took strength, it seemed to me, from having this light. And she was guided, led to this metaphorical tunnel I always see that leads to the light. Pulled by the natural current that goes up this tunnel, she walked up. Then something else happened that I've not seen before. The walls and ceiling and floor of this symbolic tunnel were covered in It actually looked like sea anemones or something, like fingers, white fingers in every direction, rippling in front of her. It felt as if she had been given an assignment before she was ever born into her mortal Anne Frank self. Her soul had agreed to undertake a very, very arduous experience. Not for her own benefit, but for the benefit of the world, so that the world could learn, so that she could be an example, an ambassador for light and truth amid so much darkness. Her soul had said yes to this assignment. Yes, I will do that. Anne Frank, the girl, had had to endure the nightmare of that experience. But now, she was being congratulated, it felt like, at an ethereal, cosmic grace level for completing her assignment. It's rather like when somebody runs a very, very long race despite terrible odds and they make it and everybody applauds at the end. These rippling sea anemone-like fingers seem to be welcoming her back. That was the hardest thing you will ever have to do. Well done for completing the job. She had become an iconic figurehead for understanding and truth about the Holocaust. And it didn't seem to me like there was a specific passage into the light for Anne Frank at the end of this transition. It was more like she merged with the fingers, the tendrils, whatever these were. It was all one. It was like, yes, well done, welcome home. It felt glorious. It felt like the biggest reward the universe could ever give you. Not a consolation for the hell she had been through as a mortal, but on the soul level, there seemed to be no greater accomplishment than this kind of sacrifice she had undertaken. And she merged into the light and was gone. That in itself was revelatory. But I don't know that as a human being, on this side of the ethereal divide, I don't know that I will ever look at my life again in the same way. I don't know that I can get out of my head, nor would I ever want to, that sense of, oh, it is true then. We are guarded and guided by forces unseen. Our step is protected. We are looked after every step of the way by a benevolent universe. These were just words to me before. Words I kind of believed, but the journalistic side of me, which is inevitable, I was in journalism for about 25, 30 years, the journalistic side of me was always going, yeah, but really? Do we absolutely know that, or are we all just theorizing that that's the truth? Having seen that reflection of the beam, the arc of light in the pool, I will never doubt again. The universe is on our side. It has our back. And that's what I learned from Anne Frank.